Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Glodine Brown, and I'm the general manager here at CAFKA. This year, CAFKA is celebrating its 20th anniversary, and the CAFKA.21 Biennial is taking place as a series of activations throughout the summer, bringing contemporary art to primarily outdoor public spaces across Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge. CAFKA.21's theme, Everything Not Saved Will Be Lost, invites us to reflect on our everyday practices, our values, and our hopes. It also asks us to think about the things that could and perhaps should be left behind. We are pleased to be presenting this talk tonight in partnership with the University of Waterloo Art Gallery. Several of this year's biennial projects address white supremacy directly and promote public conversations about it. We are grieving with the Muslim community at the loss of Salman Afzal, Medea Salman, Yumna Salman, and Talat Afzal, who were brutally murdered in a premeditated hate crime. Fayez Salman was seriously wounded. Everyone should be able to be safe in public spaces, the spaces that are central to CAFKA's mission. CAFKA stands in solidarity with the Muslim community. People in Waterloo Region can report incidents of hate and discrimination motivated by racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia at reportinghate.ca. The Hate Crime and Discrimination Documentation Project is led by the Coalition of Muslim Women of KW and is part of Waterloo Region's response to Islamophobia program. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the space and the land that we are on today. CAFKA operates within the region of Waterloo, located on the Haldeman Tract, which is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The Haldeman Tract includes 6 miles deep from each side of the Grand River, beginning at Lake Erie and extending north to the head of the river. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Six Nations of the Grand River, were granted this land to enjoy forever as part of the 1784 Haldeman Treaty between the British and their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution, when they were dispossessed from their land in upstate New York. The Haldeman Tract was reduced to less than 5% of this original territory in the over 200 years since the treaty, through the loss of land to the settlement of newcomers. The Haudenosaunee Great Law emphasizes collective responsibilities and rights, and with this, the principle of the dish with one spoon, a treaty extended to the Anishinaabe and British, which stipulated that the land was to be shared equally, collectively, and with the utmost attention paid to peaceful relations and the conservation of lands for future generations, all signified in the connotation of a single spoon used by all to eat from a single dish. As we are joined today in this virtual space, it's important to acknowledge that wherever in Canada we are presently tuning in from, all of what we term as Canada continues to operate under the violent project of settler colonialism, a trauma whose evidence unfortunately continues to surprise settlers, but is well known amongst Indigenous nations and survivors, as we have witnessed in the recent discovery of 215 children buried in Kamloops. In the spirit of everything not saved will be lost, I'd like to draw your attention to the Woodland Cultural Center in Brantford, whose organizational operation and campaign entitled Save the Evidence works to repair the Mohawk Residential School as a site of conscience, with the final goal aimed to be the definitive destination for information about the history of residential schools in Canada, the experiences of survivors of the schools, and the impact that the residential school system has had on Indigenous communities. If you have not already, please consider learning more about this organization and donating to this important campaign. The settler colonial process continues to dispossess lands from the Indigenous peoples whose traditional territories we, as settlers, occupy today. As an organization composed of individual artists, arts workers, and community members with diverse backgrounds and histories, it is always our responsibility to learn, acknowledge, respect, and uphold the treaties made with Indigenous nations and respect the right to the land and life on unceded territories whose traditional caretakers continue to resist colonial violence today. Now, just before I make the introductions, I'd just like to remind everyone of our community guidelines and zero tolerance policy. We hold zero tolerance for the use of slurs, offensive language, racism, and any form of marginalization or discrimination. Any violation of those terms will result in the participant being removed from the session. We would like to make sure that this virtual space is welcoming to all. So feel free to use the chat to ask any questions and make any comments. We'll do some Q&A at the end. And now I would like to introduce our panelists. So first, I'd like to introduce Ivan Jurakic. He is the director and curator at the University of Waterloo Art Gallery. He is also a practicing artist and part of the TH&B Artist Collective. He lives in Hamilton. Aaron T. Francis is a doctoral student at the University of Waterloo, a multidisciplinary artist and a curator. He is the former chair of the City of Kitchener's Arts and Culture Advisory Committee and has exhibited work from his Vintage Black Canada initiative at the Band Gallery, the Gladstone Hotel, the Contact Photography Festival, the Center for International Governance, as well as the Ryerson University's Fashion and Lace Database. In 2019, he launched Vintage Black Canada on Instagram as a multidisciplinary, creative, and collaborative initiative founded with the express purpose of documenting the transnational modern history of the African diaspora in Canada. Tamarack Drive features a series of images taken in 1969 by Aaron's grandfather, Jamaican-born, Waterloo-based photographer Roy Francis, captured on Kodak Ektachrome 35mm transparency film and developed by Roy. The series offers a candid glimpse of Caribbean Canadian life in Waterloo that includes Aaron's grandmother, mother, and uncles who appear alongside one another outside the family home located on Tamarack Drive, a 20-minute walk from the University of Waterloo, and on family trips to Niagara Falls and the Canadian National Exhibition. Tamarack Drive was made possible through the generous support of the Region of Waterloo Arts Fund. And now I will turn it over to Aaron and Ivan.
Thank you, Claudine. Appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that.
Ivan, how are you?
I'm good, Aaron. Yourself?
Good, thank you. Thank you.
Just following up on that introduction, a few thank yous to, obviously, to Aaron for gracing us with this project and trusting me and the University of Waterloo Art Gallery to deliver it. Also wanted to, just for the sake of people who might be at this event who haven't seen the piece, the University of Waterloo Art Gallery is located, the street address is 263 Phillip Street in Waterloo. The gallery is closed to the public, but the piece is actually on the street-facing window facade of East Campus Hall, facing out onto Phillip Street. So you could go visit the piece as either in your vehicle, or you can pull up and take a look at it, or walk to it as well. So it is visible in theory 24 hours a day, but obviously it's not specifically lit at night, but it's visible a lot of the time, so you can go visit it without having to worry about going indoors or things like that. So again, the actual location of the space is 263 Phillip Street. Wanted to thank Westmount Signs for the printing and some of their technical assistance. Jean Stevenson for the work she did scanning Roy's and Aaron's original slides. And again, the Region of Waterloo Arts Fund for providing the seed funding for the project. So with those thank yous out of the way, I just wanted to sort of jump in a little bit with Aaron and ask you just to basically kind of fill us in a bit and tell us a little bit about your family's Caribbean Canadian background, particularly in regards to being in the Region of Waterloo, and how this has inspired the work you're doing with Vintage Black Canada.
Sure. Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's an honor. Thank you for having me, and thank you so much for everyone that's here just supporting this project. You know, I had to, as a curator and as a researcher, go back and truly understand, you know, how did my family get here and when? And so the truth is, so in the mid 1960s, my grandfather Roy came. He came a little bit ahead of the family. The family came afterwards, and they came via Leeds, England, where they were for about 10 years, but also ultimately from Jamaica. So my grandfather, Roy Francis, the photographer, the individual whom I have the honor of curating his works, he is from Maxfield Avenue, Jamaica, like the cultural epicenter of so much, and it's truly informed very much my practice, very much my curiosity, just my approach. Maxfield Avenue is it's a street that probably a lot of people have never heard of, but it's essentially like one of the foundations of, you know, dance hall culture, sound system culture. You know, that's the kind of street you just see Bob Marley walking on in the 80s, that sort of thing, or the 70s or whatever, or in the 50s, you know what I'm saying? Like, and it was right beside Orange Street. And like, these are the places that founded dancehall culture. But ultimately, dancehall culture, I love the fact that it contributes so much to hip hop culture, which is something that I also always informs my practice. And this idea of my art is better than your art. This idea of sound clashing, this idea of being like audiophiles, this being truly obsessive over one's like output culturally and creatively. And so with my family migrating here, for me, going back and looking through these artifacts, it's not just about my family, but it's about my culture in general and understanding who I am as a Jamaican and as an African.
That's it's interesting because we haven't really talked about that, but that notion of like MC sort of the toasting sort of battles, the one-upmanship. That's really interesting. That's something I wouldn't have thought of. So I mean, you and I met in fall of 2019 when we first sort of were introduced and talked. And at the time, I mean, I would it see like the Vintage Black Canada, the Instagram, which is the way my sort of entry point to your work was, had maybe been kind of happening for a couple months, like not for more than beyond 2019. So it was fairly fresh.
Right.
So I'm sort of curious in terms of taking this inspirational material, was there kind of a specific aha kind of moment, like, oh, here's where it all comes together for me, that kind of that put it all together for you in 2019? Like what was there kind of a collective kind of impetus that made this happen for you, that you know you had to do this?
Well, it's worth noting firstly that Ivan, your reputation preceded you. So I had two very influential individuals in my life, you know, mentors, if you will, Travis Staley and Christian Snyder, and they're both on sort of opposite sides of the spectrum in terms of their practice. But they're both like, oh, you have to meet Ivan, he's that guy. And I don't remember, and I won't even go into it. You know, just both had really great things to say about you as a human being. And I don't remember, I think maybe you emailed me, or I think I probably emailed you. But anyhow, when
you reached out to me because there was a project at Biennial Gallery in Toronto, which I honestly I wasn't familiar with at the time. And we had a couple of emails, and I realized that you were in the region, and then it was sort of like, well, hey, why don't we meet? Like it was that straightforward. It's like, oh, you're in the area, like, why don't we meet sometime?
But again, like notably, like you know, I have that hustle, so I've emailed a lot of folks, and not everyone responds. You were one of the people that responded, so thank you for that. And in time, we got to meet. In terms of the aha moment, well, I've said it before. Like I started to delve into the archive once my grandfather passed away. You know, it was one of these things. Like I grew up knowing that he took photos, but he was a full-time working professional in the tech aerospace world. And so I knew that he was a photographer, but as just like growing up as a young person, didn't give it the sort of attention that it warranted. And then he passed away, and I came across, there was a specific set of photos. It was my mom. It's the first 3 photos. If anyone has the time, you scroll back to the very beginning of Vintage Black Canada. It's the first 3 photos I posted. and they were shot on his Rolleiflex, which is like a single lens reflex camera, the ones you look down in, and they're very distinct because they're square photos. And when I saw those 3 photos, I was like, oh my God, because they're just, they check all the boxes in terms of like aesthetic appeal, just the way that they're beautiful images. But then speaking with my mom and understanding the process behind the images, that's when I was like, wow, really, there's like, wow, Granddad really was a photographer. Because I remember my mom saying like, oh, this photo here, this is like 1 of 10. This is the one he decided on. Like, it wasn't, she can still recall being like, oh, are we done yet? Like, no, like, we got to get this just right. And he paid attention to that practice. And so when I saw these images, and then I saw that I also had the negatives, and I started, and then the photo books, and I realized like, wow, this, Granddad was an archivist and an art collector. And when it took me a few months to realize, well, these aren't even all his photos. It's like the collection that I have like proper, and on me is like 80% his photos, and like 20% photos that he collected from photographers that were better than him, things that just inspired him. And just seeing his appreciation for the culture, it surprised me, but it didn't surprise me because, well, he's always been that way. I also inherited not just his photos, his record collection. And, it's one of the largest, I would say I have one of the largest reggae collections in Southern Ontario, reggae record collection. And that's because of him, because he was just a fan of the culture. So, yeah, was there an aha moment? There definitely was. But at the same time, it had just been building up my entire life. And it was a great reminder to know that I had like a mission in life. I felt like I had something that I had to do. I had to share this with the world.
It's interesting because when you're a kid, you do often disregard or overlook parents or grandparents and the previous generation because you're busy doing your own thing or you're not quite paying attention. So retroactively, you having this clearly very deep, meaningful response and relationship to the archive that your family and you inherit from Roy, it is very powerful and I think very moving. And the fact that you do have an image maker in the family is, sort of emphasizes all these sort of strengths and ties in like, yeah, I didn't actually know that you'd also inherited this giant record collection, which could be a whole other sort of discussion.
Oh, man.
But so I'm, knowing that this is sort of an inheritance, really. So, I mean, as a fellow image maker, how do you sort of equate your relationship with Roy then, I suppose, retroactively, because you're working with these images that he originally took. He not only took, but again, that he was actually developing these images, which was an interesting thing we could talk a bit more about. So I'm curious, as in your role as kind of artist, curator, archivist, would you venture to guess what Roy's take on your reimagining or sort of working with this as archival material might be, how he might respond to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't even hesitate to try to use that as a litmus, because that is essentially my standard. Like, would Granddad appreciate this? But even like almost more to the point, it's like, is this okay with my mom, my uncles, with my community? Am I doing this right? Am I telling stories right? So I'm constantly checking in, trying to constantly ground myself, because that is, it's like when you know something, but then when you truly know something, I'm like, I know the community that I come from, but going back to the images and over the years and just, and in writing out the stories, and I realized, wow, it truly takes a village. I am who I am, not because I affirmed as such, but because I'm Roy Francis's grandson, So I know he would be proud, because he himself was an archivist and just a fan of the culture. just a fan, really. Like he was a fan of all things blackness. I've got a huge collection of like towards his later years, he was recording like Nigerian films, and I just have a bunch of those. I have like a trunk full of Nigerian films. I have all kinds of like live reggae performances from the 90s on cassette that I've been trying to digitize. I have so many books that I've barely been able to get through. Books that he would have handed me when I was younger and just been like, hey, check this out. Like there's a history of Jamaica book that I remember he gave me when I was 12. And I was like, yeah, all right, granddad, thanks. And like, I'm reading it voraciously now. And just I can't get enough of it. And so I'm quite certain he would have been proud. And I hear as much from my mom. So God bless her, and my uncles. It means a lot. And so
Seeing you, as you brought up your mom, Angela,
yeah.
I had the pleasure of meeting her briefly a few weeks back when you did the CTV Kitchener interview, and she's actually the young girl that's pictured in the images, so in the pool and in all the images. So again, maybe you kind of answered it, as you could expand on this. She also spoke very passionately about, because she was interviewed as well, which I didn't know was going to happen, and she spoke very well about like her feelings about the work, and again being part of the Caribbean Canadian community in Kitchener, Waterloo region. So beyond that, what's her reaction? What's her take to sort of, again, kind of having her childhood sort of put forward in such a sort of, I guess, public context?
I'm glad you asked. It's really important to lay context of these images. I try my very best with the captions, if you haven't noticed. And I know that she's okay with it. She's like a co-conspirator with me. Like a lot of images I have to run by her. So like, who is this mom? Like, who are these people? You only know so many of your family. Mine's spread across the Atlantic. I think though and I know for a fact that there's some challenging moments for her, because number one, we have lots to be proud of. Coming here, one of maybe a half dozen, West Indian families, and generations later, like here I am. We've done our thing, and so lots to be proud of, and then it's worth sharing that. And I think the same could be said for every immigrant in Canada. You know what I'm saying? Like seriously. But I know that my mom, for example, like, I'm sorry to break everyone's heart, but like the dog in the image is like, my mom told me that the truth is like, a racist man ran over that dog and shouted the N-word as he drove off laughing, the dog that's in that image. So that's Waterloo then. And obviously as the world turns. So, you have these images, but when you put them in context, you find joy within your family, within your community, because sometimes that's all you have. But also, the flip side of that is there's a series of images we have, and there's you have to go back a little bit in mine, and they're not in the Tamarack set per se, but there's a white girl at one of the birthday parties, like a young girl, and I remember my mom telling me a story about how like that was a girl that helped defend her in a moment of trepidation when she was essentially being accosted by like some bad boys, some bad racist boys. So I know from for me, I have my own. We all have our own triggers, and so for my mom, she's strong. She's an empress, so I'm certain that it's not easy. Sometimes seeing the dog, and I remember I was like, "Oh, mom, what's the dog's name?" Spot, and then and then she'll tell the story, and then that's life.
Oh my God! I honestly, I wasn't aware of that story, and I mean, we were doing with the printer color corrections, and he pulled out the dog because he likes dogs, and so I had no idea. That's so loaded in retrospect, but at the same time, the kind of the obvious joy you speak about so many of the other things. Yeah, that's really troubling in a way. But then I'm going to, instead of steering away from that trouble, maybe I'll steer toward it a little bit, I think, because I think like a lot of things have happened in the last 2 weeks, let alone the last 3-4 years, let alone the last 400 years.
Yeah.
So as overall as positive, I think, a project as this is, and I'm thrilled by the opportunity of you and I working together on this, and creating a small but I think meaningful platform, and then that platform kind of tying into CAFKA as well. That idea of this kind of insistent and insipid kind of color bias and racism, and the idea that your grandfather Roy is a photographer and he's developing his own film, and this sort of came up in a conversation we had earlier in the week.
Right.
I you know, spending time with the work, I'd done some reading, and there's been a lot of talk over the last decade about Kodak's use of the Shirley cards. So through I can't remember the exact dates, but through the 50s and 60s and up till probably about, I think it was 1996 that they stopped using them. Kodak had a model called Shirley originally that they used as a kind of an archetype for all their professional photo development. She was a young white model, so they were using the Shirley card to calibrate all the color corrections for all their commercial production. So, you know, back in the day, I still remember you'd have a Kodak booth in the middle of a parking lot and you drop off your film and things like that. So they'd be using this Shirley card or some variation of it to color correct all this film. And this isn't something that, you know, remembering film development pre-digital, this isn't something I would have thought of, but in retrospect, anyone who's a person of color is having their birthday parties, their family events, their marriages, anything that's going through a Kodak color lab is being basically color corrected based on, you know, a completely Caucasian modeling.
Mm-hmm.
Which seems outrageous. And it's not something it's something you take for granted until you don't take it for granted and you become aware of it.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if there's an answer to this, and I'm sort of curious because it wasn't something we talked about initially, so I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm curious if since we talked, if you had found out, like, it's interesting, like Roy would have been developing his own film, so he wouldn't have been tied into that. I don't think he would have been tied into the system of the Shirley card. But if those Ektachrome color slides that make up the basis for Tamarack Drive had been developed commercially, or had been developed, you know, had been sent to a lab, I'm curious like how different those outcomes might have been. Again, I don't know if you can answer this, but this is just something that kind of seems to be, you know, part of that discussion of photography now, right?
Right. It's true. And I'm glad that, you know, it really speaks to your attention to detail that you raised this question. And as far as I can tell, at some point that these were legit, like some of the first images that he took. And I had been completely under the impression that I saw his darkroom, I saw his equipment that he used to develop his images. But for this series now, based on what you're telling me, I cannot say 100% that he developed them. Based on like our little conversation that we're having, I cannot say 100%. Everything after that, 100%. Once he moved to the Rolleiflex, which essentially, so I should back up a little bit. The whole thing about the whole Tamarack Drive, as you know, Ivan, it was a box of images that was handed to me like late November. So we had started speaking like September, and was like, let's figure this out. What kind of images you want? At that point, every single image that I had by Roy Francis was developed by Roy Francis, or it was clearly not, and it was earmarked as such. So my Uncle Dave, at this point, I had done a couple of really cool kind of gallery shows like CG Band, and had some awesome press. And then my Uncle Dave had been like hiding the slides from me, and he said, "You know what? It looks like you're kind of doing your thing. Why don't you have these? I've been, keeping them from you." I don't know. I was blown away, and so it was my first time seeing the slides. So this is fully a year after I'm posting and archiving that I get this new collection, which was perfect for our conversation or for our collaboration. So to answer the question, I don't know. I can no longer say to a certainty that Roy Francis developed these images, even though he developed so many of his other images. But I can say this: it's interesting that I have to only speculate now. Is this in part why he moved on from the Ektachrome to the Rolleiflex? It's a great question. I've had to try to unravel the mystery of his photography, because I mean, it's not disparaging to say, like, bear in mind, this is a man that came from, literally like late 1940s, early 1950s, came to Jamaica. And when he went to England, he wasn't a photographer. So when I first started examining his images, I noticed like, oh, these are like really great photos. And then like, oh, this is an excellent photo. This is perfect. So like, what's the difference? And so I started peeling them off really slowly and looking on the back. And there were certain ones that were stamped Gerald Dawn. And then by chance, I Googled Gerald Dawn, and Gerald Dawn, like, there's pretty much only like one thing that came up at the time. And it was like, there was a Jamaican historical society in Leeds, England, that was looking for images of Gerald Dawn because they were hosting an exhibit. And so this is like pre-vintage Black Canada. This is like just before I started. I'm like, I don't know if this is a good idea. Who's this Gerald Dawn guy? Turns out all these folks in England, they're like looking for Gerald Dawn photos. Meanwhile, I'm sitting on like 100 Gerald Dawn because my grandfather collected them. And Gerald Dawn is essentially, he was this Jewish photographer in England in the 1950s. If you have a chance to look up the Windrush generation, that's what they refer to the Black folks that came from the Caribbean. After the war, England was devastated. They needed people, so they decided to let all the Caribs in, and that's the quote unquote Windrush generation. And so in Leeds, this dude Gerald Dawn was taking all of those photos, and my grandfather, for some reason, he was keen and attentive to what Gerald was doing, because then I could note, oh, within 5-6 years, my grandfather's taking photos just like Gerald Dawn. So mind you, like, my grandfather's collection dates back to literally the 1920s. But really, like, when he started collecting Gerald Dawns, that he started trying to mimic them. And I really think that they might have had some conversations about photography. My grandfather was himself an engineer, so he paid attention to symmetry and aesthetics and visual harmonies. So that came naturally to Gerald Dawn. And so this is something I hope to explore later on, or at least, or in the foreseeable future, in sort of comparing the symmetrical attempts that the visual output of, like, trying to adhere to straight symmetry. But long story short, what are we talking about? Seriously.
I'm just wrapped up in your narrative.
My bad. I am too. I can't remember what your original question was, is what I mean.
Well, I think it was coming out of this idea that which images Roy was developing, and this interesting notion that and it's it's something obviously I wouldn't know, but you're sort of figuring out too, like, was that transition from the 35mm Kodak Ektachrome, which is the images that make up the Tamarack Drive project, to using the Rolleiflex. Does that somehow bridge some sort of developing divide? So are the Ektachrome slides that were basically used and we scanned for this project, did they go through the Kodak commercial process, which means they would have been processed using the Shirley cards, versus
Yes.
you can establish that by the time he's using the Rolleiflex that he's developing his own images.
Yes.
And again, it's just a fascinating, it's just an interesting question, and it's not one I expected you to be able to answer, but that idea of the Shirley card and the idea of what normal is in terms of color, right? The idea of color, technical color photography, but let's talk about color in terms of culture and society, right?
Well, let me say one more thing to that. Oh man.
Yeah.
There's a fellow named Joshua Kissy, and he developed an app / filter that was, with his input and working with VSCO, to rectify that very challenge. Because from his perspective as a professional photographer, he was just named as one of top 1 influential creatives, top 100, what have you. But this is a dude that, back in the day, he was a photographer that noted that, and he went out of his way to create this application. It wasn't something that I had noticed prior to Joshua Kissy mentioning it, and I had heard of it leading up to our conversation, but I think it's probably an ongoing conversation. I mean, so you get to the point wherein you have Black folks literally developing the technology themselves or being at the table when it's being done. I'm not sure how good it will get or how accurate it will be in terms of the tonalities, right? We have the same challenge with challenge or blessing with facial recognition technology. It just doesn't work for Black people. And so, or it, doesn't work as
or it's biased to a normal Caucasian, default, essentially, right? White is our kind of default for a lot of technological innovations, it seems. It's been built into the system.
Well, if there's one thing you can say with technology, it is somewhat of an equalizer. So I'm sure in time, someone fix that issue. Hey, maybe I live in a tech town. Maybe I'll have to fix it.
So I'm curious also, sort of we'll tie in, this actually ties in, sort of stepping back a little bit, to the record collection, which I wasn't aware about. But I read a piece you had published last year in the Fashion and Race database about your uncle Errol. And Errol Starr was a prominent musician. I knew about his work in the 80s, even as a kid in high school. He was a really well-known name. So, if anyone who came of age in the 80s was around this sort of GTA, it's like, oh, that flashy Errol Starr guy, you kind of knew who he was.
Yeah.
So it was really great to read your take on your famous Uncle Errol. So and maybe this does tie in. I'm curious if Errol's public persona then as a musician, and he was noted as a showman, has had any influence on your work, and whether there might be. He has appeared over the course of the last couple of years on Vintage Black Canada. So I'm curious, using this sort of family trajectories, if there might be some sort of project involving him or something. Is that something you've considered?
Oh man, totally. It's been a driver from jump. There is an Errol Starr documentary / movie in the works. It's just a matter of time. Bear with us. And his is a story worth telling, truly, because and I mean this sincerely, because he achieved certain pinnacles of artistic and peer recognition. However, those things weren't what they seemed to be for him. And so what he imparted to me was, ideas of trying to achieve self-sustainability and trying to achieve equilibrium with your environment, trying to establish relationships with your indigenous communities, trying to be a good father and husband. So as much as, as a young kid watching, I turn on the TV and see my Uncle Errol turn on the radio, and, he's the first Black man I ever seen in a limo. So, by the time I was like 6, I was like, oh, okay, anything's possible. Like that was definitely something that he imparted on me. But I think more to the point, and just trying to get also to just the heart of his narrative, which I've been writing with my brothers, and just trying to get the heart of his narrative is like, wow, like really like the lasting impression. And he's still active. Like, I'm not talking about him in past tense, but the lasting impression is a man that was seeking equilibrium and sustainability, and I think truly life lessons. With my grandfather passing, he is in many respects the patriarch of the family now, and you saw that with even like at my grandfather's funeral, and just the way he presided over the ceremony. And it was a ceremony because he's a musician, my uncle, and he pulled out his guitar and brought the family up. And he is one of these rare individuals that, because my Uncle Errol was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and then he when he left there, the rest of the family, the rest of his siblings were born in England, and then so that was his second home, and then Canada was his third home. And, he was the first person in the 80s that, like, the main reason we went to Toronto was to go see my Uncle Errol. And so he was always pushing the envelope in these ways. And the article speaks to that. If you get a chance, we'd love for you to check out for anyone here curious to check out the Fashion Race Database piece, because I speak to this idea of him using his fierce approach to fashion and individuality to essentially draw a line in the sand in terms of his persona. He crafted it himself, no one crafted it for him. And he's cut from a very particular cloth, like sort of like right from the source in many ways. But some of his siblings, or sort of his peer group, are people like Master T, who essentially like revolutionized music entertainment in Canada, and as well as like Lennox Lewis, who these are just like local Kitchener guys that went on to do like global things. So please stay tuned for the Errol Star story.
That's great. I will have to keep looking forward to that. I mean, in that regard, you're doing your doctoral work at the University of Waterloo. I'm sort of wondering how this kind of does it all intersect these parallel streams you're on?
So you're bringing up just at the end there. Can you hear me, Ivan? Because you look frozen.
Oh, sorry. Did you?
Okay. I feel like I know where you're going with that. You're asking how much the connection between my PhD work and my curatorial work is. That?
Yeah. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it was just how does the doctoral work sort of overlap and or influence your work as an artist and curator, and or vice versa, basically? Like, are all these things connected, or are they kind of parallel?
Well, it's definitely like an ongoing studentship and sort of self-apprenticeship and understudyship and being mentored. And it took me a long time to get to this place, truly, because I do come from a world of creative arts, and to be in academia, quote unquote, I never imagined that I'd be able to talk about things that were truly important to me, which is a sad admission. But thankfully, when I applied and I got in, it was like, long story short, my background area of research and study was Chinese foreign policy, and it's really fascinating to me. I truly enjoy learning about Chinese history and Chinese politics and speaking Mandarin, but I never really thought that I could center in on things that were so close to my heart, which is essentially Jamaica. So my proposed thesis looks at Chinese foreign direct investment in the Caribbean and in the extractive industries, in particular like bauxite, oil, and all a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is like a massive development initiative that China's using to spread influence and secure their supply chains and all kind of like boring stuff. But for me, it's like, oh wow, I get to do research on Jamaica, because when you look at China's interactions with Jamaica, you have to look at them. Well, I have to now not just look at them through the lens that's been given to me, but through a lens that I'm crafting myself, and just from the lens of Maxfield Avenue, where my grandfather's from, for example. Like, so I found a way to merge sort of my interests, and even like I'll say like Channel One Studio, which is like a famous like reggae studio from the 80s. Sly and Robbie would record there. That was owned by a Chinese Jamaican. So there's so much interesting transnationalism that's occurring between China and Jamaica, and there's a scholarly gap in terms of China-Jamaica relations, China-Guyana relations. So I really found a niche that excites me, and there's something true to heart for me. And it's, as an undergrad or as a master's student, you're kind of taught like you have to be objective. I had a really cool, really dope supervisor, Jasmine Habib, who was just like, objectivity is not possible. So just talk about what you want, but highlight your inherent biases. And so here I am.
That's very fair. It's absolutely true. There's no pure objectivity, but one can be, I think, self-objective or self-critical or self-aware. And I knew you were doing some of that study, and but I didn't understand how it connected to Jamaica, and so that's very fascinating, because I was aware that there was a lot of Chinese investment in Africa in particular, but I didn't know it sort of crossed the Atlantic in that specific way. I had no awareness of that. So that's a very interesting thing to pull out. Quite fascinating. I just maybe kind of to wrap, I just maybe is in kind of closing, like two related or unrelated things. It was, again, sort of starting on this project, we kind of started, I think, on one path, and for me working with you, if there was an aha moment, it was like things were good, but the aha moment was when you started showing me the slides that you took or the scans you took of Roy's work, the Tamarack Drive work, because all of a sudden it locked the work into a neighborhood that kind of maybe I didn't understand, but a neighborhood I had some familiarity with, and a neighborhood that was related to the University of Waterloo, which was then related to the site where my gallery operates. And all of a sudden all these different streams seem to sort of like come together and make sense. So I guess if less than closing this, I'm sort of sharing this kind of this moment of kismet that you and I hope both had. Yep. Around that, because I could sense your excitement about these, and I think you could sense that I was sort of like, yeah, this is it, right?
Manifestation is real.
So kind of running out from that, I mean, just how did you feel about the process of sort of taking the work from like the original images to kind of Instagram postings, to kind of a more maybe a traditional gallery setup, exhibition sort of setup, to then kind of expanding it into a kind of a public intervention? Like how was that process for you? Was that interesting? Was it challenging? Is that something, and again, as if we're going to talk about the future, whether we're talking about an Errol Star project or whatever, like, yeah, this is a project that you brought to the table, and we were able to put together. but is this maybe a direction? Is this, where do you see this going? Like as far as Vintage Black Canada and your future projects?
Yeah, I mean, I want to, as an individual, challenge myself to try very much just about anything. And so, had I envisioned an outdoor photo installation previously? No. But when you brought the idea to me, I was like, yeah, I'm all for it. And for me, like, again, like the Aerostar project, right now, I understand that with this work, I am very much a curator, but I'm comfortable, more than comfortable, referring to myself also as an artist because of my past body of work, which so many of you aren't even aware of, because I come from the recording arts world, if you will. And so now I'm a visual artist and curator, which is fine. These are disciplines. They're like chambers that one should not certainly take for granted. But I don't see myself beholden to any one of them. And I think that's a good thing. I think that would probably piss off a lot of disciplinarians, but I refer to myself as a multidisciplinarian. And so moving forward, we'll see, for example, I realized for myself, the individual challenge I set for myself is like, okay, I've curated a lot of my grandfather's photos. So certainly there'll be a photo book, which will kind of be the capstone of what I'm doing with his work. But then I need to start showing you all some of my photos. And that's just a matter of time. And I have thankfully have confidence in my own photography. But I also have a great challenge that my brother, Adam, AKA Astral, is, the most in-demand photographer in the city of Toronto. So I have that sibling rivalry challenge that I have a new bar. So the mantle got passed from it. Actually, the mantle went over my head and went to my brother Astral. And yet here I am. Really, like, moving forward, I'm happy to share that the Art Gallery of Ontario has requested some of my material for an upcoming exhibit. So that is something that more details will be released in the coming weeks.
That's fantastic. Congrats.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Julie Crooks, through her assistant, reached out to me. And so with that box that my uncle gave me and with the slides, there was also a couple of Super 8 films and of Caravana in the early 80s. Just like super rare stuff, man. Like, I went and looked up Caravana. I was just like, oh, let's see what CBC has. Like, no, I've got better footage. So the AGO has requested that, among some other images, for a very interesting exhibit. And so just the beginning of the year, I was awarded Waterloo Region Arts Fund grant. And that helps me bridge sort of what my grandfather did and what I'm doing. Because with that grant, what I proposed was to curate works with artists in collaborative context, wherein they reinterpret my grandfather's works under our sort of mutual, tete-a-tete. So that will be probably one of the last exhibits of the year, if that's kind of the case. And then, yeah, man, I mean, I've said it before, I really want to continue embarking on some digital stuff. So Vintage Black Canada virtual reality, Vintage Black Canada AI. This is where I really want to take it. I mean, I've been so fortunate to witness every evolutionary, like, technological epoch, from the mobile phone to, like, because I had the beeper, and and I had the BlueBerry, the original BlackBerry, these things, and like I watched it all happening, so I know what's coming next. It's quite obvious to me, and I want to be there for that ride.
Well, that's great. Again, congratulations on being part of an AGO project. That's really great. The reach that this work is having.
Yeah, man.
And then also, that there's clearly, you're part of this continuum there within your family. Your grandfather, your uncle, and you and your brother, who, again, I think I met briefly when I met your mom, Angela, right?
Yep.
Again, and I'm only sort of, as an outsider, starting to draw some of those dots together. But that's a really, I think it's a really powerful thing. And so that idea that why would you limit yourself? I mean, you describe yourself as a multidisciplinary artist and curator, and there's there's no reason why one would need to put a box on that. But again, I don't know, maybe this might be, I don't know. Did you have any other thoughts or things you wanted to share, Aaron?
No. That was great. I really appreciate that. It's good to say it out loud. Manifestation is real. That's probably the only takeaway you folks need to have. Ivan and I said, let's do something. What are we going to do? And then someone handed me a box of photos and said, so I don't know, is there any questions from anyone maybe?
Yeah, I was going to say this might be a good time to kind of open it up if people didn't want to hear me talk anymore, please.
Thank you for that, Ivan and Aaron. That was a really insightful and interesting conversation. I'm just going to take a look in the chat to see if there are any questions. See if our behind the scenes team has any questions coming through. I don't see any at the moment. Let's just give it a second.
Wait.
Oh, I have a question here from Michelle. She wants to know how long the photos are going to be up for.
So on paper, the Tamarack Drive will be on display till December 31st. The end of the year, it's probably going to go through into next spring. So it should have an entire 12-month run. One thing we're waiting on is if the vinyl starts to deteriorate. I haven't done this before, and neither has Aaron. So we know the vinyl is rated. It's supposed to be good, 365 day, sun, rain. So it's supposed to last up to 12 months. So I want to see if we could take it that far, but I think this would be a decision that Aaron and I would make with respect to if there was any disintegration or fading of color quality or things like that. I think that if that started to happen, we would have a discussion about potentially striking the piece, but we're hoping that it would roughly be up. We installed it in end of April, early May, basically to launch. Sorry, we just installed it the other month, so we're hoping it will be up for a full year.
Oh no, that's great. I'm always on board with images of Black people taking up lots of space in public. So,
Hey.
yeah. Let's see. I have a question from Scott. I guess this is for Aaron. So do you find yourself shooting photos like your grandfather, similar to how he viewed Gerald Dawn?
Yeah, absolutely. Symmetry. I'm a huge fan of Wes Anderson. I think that's the sort of standard in terms of the layouts. There's certain approaches that I think are almost like universal language, and I know that my grandfather was trying to achieve that, and especially like low key as like a Mason. I have some really cool like Masonic images where like you have the chessboard and just the rule of thirds and these things, like they pay attention to those things. Gerald Dawn paid attention to them, and I do too. So yeah, definitely that influences me. You can even see just the way I set up my like screen now, like.
Let's see, a question from Jackie. It says, hey, Aaron, great talk. I was wondering how you feel about working in the archives. Are there any mixed feelings, knowing that it historically was restricted to a racist academia?
So great question. Aside from, yes and no. Like, no one's going to tell your story for you. You got to tell your own story. So if I went to the KPL, the KPL main, and then there's like an archival room there, and that's where I did a great deal of like my initial scans. And so shout out to them. And then, I went and looked at like, they have these like photographs or yearbooks or historical books. There isn't really any Black people in them, but I'm going to do a book, and then maybe one day it'll sit on that shelf. So, and then maybe I'll inspire someone else. So yeah, it's a little frustrating, but at the same time, I've just, you have to take a bit of responsibility for communicating your own message. So I'm happy to be that person. Yes and no. So, and just, I hope I didn't miscommunicate, but the great number of the photos I have are from a personal archive. So no disappointment there.
Okay, thank you. Question from Charles. She said, I'm very interested in Aaron's research into the Chinese-Jamaican connection. Does Aaron do any photography himself? And would he go to Jamaica and document what's happening there?
Yep, 100%. So I have to go to Jamaica and document it. So my first international trip as a youth was to Leeds, England, where my family is, and then my next 3 international trips were to Jamaica. So by the time I was 18, I knew who I was, but then I went all around the world. So for me, it's full circle, and to go back now to Jamaica as a researcher that's what I'm saying. It's like something I never could have imagined. So it's definitely a goal. And I want to speak with, like I said, like average Jamaicans. And you have to speak with these, the decision makers and the stakeholders and stuff, but the average folks are stakeholders too. And I'll share with you all like something that no one has really done is spoken to like Chinese Jamaicans, at least the ones that have recently migrated. Because there isn't necessarily some kind of covert Chinese government agenda. These people are migrants just like any others. So I want to speak to them about their experiences in Jamaica too. So I really think my research is going to shed some light on some very sort of obscure marginalized narratives. And yep, I take photos. I definitely take photos. I'm just holding them back, but yeah.
Okay. I have a question. When was the last time you were in Jamaica?
1998.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. I went by my 3rd trip in Jamaica, and it was like, enough is enough. Because of my experience in Jamaica, we stay with family, and so still, it literally went like this. 1998, last from Jamaica, came back, graduated high school, went to university, and then went to Taiwan, and then went to Hong Kong, and then went to all these different places, Lithuania, Holland, places I can barely remember these names now. Paris, I was so Jamaican that I wanted to know what else I was. And now I want to know. Now I can't wait to get back. And it's crazy how COVID hit. So we'll see.
Yeah. Hopefully later this year, maybe next year, soon you'll get to go back. It's been about 10-ish years for me since I've been back.
Okay.
Patrice has a question for Aaron. Would you talk a little bit more about your record collection, please? Do you have a favorite reggae artist or artists? I need some new music to listen to.
Yeah, okay. Well, new music, I mean, I don't really have new reggae records, but so like Jamaica continues to blow my mind. It's like less than like 10 million Jamaicans on planet Earth. And it is with no disrespect to anyone, it is the most influential culture on planet Earth. Jamaicans created hip hop. Everywhere Jamaicans go, they do some craziness that has ramifications, repercussions, the world over, quite literally. And so it's fascinating to me, like, what the heck? Like, there's so few of us. Like I said, I grew up in this community, and like, it's maybe there's 100 Jamaicans here, and then we've got a couple like, world heavyweight championship belts in the community, a couple Junos, and like what's going on with Jamaica. So I'm constantly fascinated and constantly trying to understand Jamaica. And one of the things I learned is that Jamaica creates more music per capita than any other nation on planet Earth. So that's fascinating. That's from the Harvard Business Review. And the other thing I learned about Jamaica is fascinating. It's like it's the 3rd largest English-speaking nation in the Western Hemisphere. It's like, wait a second, like for real, but it is, and that I think has in part to do with some of Jamaica's influence because it's in essence a Black nation, but it was able to piggyback Western airwaves, and so this sort of disproportional influence. All this to say, if you want new music, new reggae music, I wouldn't be able to give you a good recommendation right now, but it's out there because there's so much music that's being created there. I mean, if off the top of my head, like Coffee to me is probably one of the dopest lyricists in the world and just really great recording artist with lots of great promise. My record collection though is mostly like vintage records, old school stuff that my granddad collected over the years. And from that collection, if I had to say I had a favorite, it's this dude named Supercat. And Supercat essentially is he's just the archetype of a really good Jamaican dancehall artist, and it came from nothing. What became something, you know, had his legal troubles and what have you, but at the end of the day, he made his mark on the culture. I will say this about Jamaica briefly. It's there was this tradition, and to this day it still exists, is that if you're the top artist and all of that, what that entails, then you have no choice but to do art battle, or if you would say sound clash with the number one contender. So every year, you have like say Sunsplash or these different events where the number one artist, you know, would have to have no choice but to sound clash and sort of defend his or her throne through music. And that's created this sort of competitive culture. I mean, not created, it's in part of that competitive culture that makes Jamaica what it is today.
Ruby wants to know, she says, it's fascinating to hear that you were studying Chinese foreign policies. I'm a Chinese artist living in the West and constantly seeing Western media criticizing Chinese government, but many of them haven't even been to China. I am curious to hear more about how this study background influences the way you make and curate work and even your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, going to China, like I said, so like my first trip outside of Jamaica, it just changed everything. So it changed everything for me. I realized that I'm like, wow, like I don't know anything about this place. This is it's an entire world, or almost like a universe, self-sustained, that they don't need to know. They don't need us whatsoever. And I right away I realized it was something, not knowing anything about Chinese culture. It was very much like it was just a fun challenge. It made me go back to school. It made me want to study and like get really good grades. And you know, there's few things that I know probably more than most folks. It's like hip hop and like China. I don't know. I don't really, because I couldn't get enough of trying to understand China and all that they contributed. And I think that well, I mean, I don't want to bore folks with like my political or world views, but China isn't doing anything that hasn't been done before by other powerful nations. And when you realize the hypocrisy of the criticisms, then you get an icky feeling because you're like, well, I think you're kind of criticizing China because they're Chinese, not because they're doing something that you disagree with. And so that gives you, this as a political scientist, I mean, going back to this idea of objectivity and what have you, you know, you have to try to rise above the fray. And living in China, very much realized, well, this is a multifaceted society, but certainly living in the West, you do not get to see it perceived as such or portrayed as such. So,
Charles says Chinese Jamaicans created the Jamaican patties.
okay.
Everybody loves patties, right?
Yeah.
A question from Robin. She wants to know, Robin, they want to know, what is your next project?
my next project. We're gonna do this AGO thingy, and then so I would have an exhibit in conjunction with AGO. Well, it's not my exhibit, but I'm lending some works to an exhibit. My next personal project, geez, I am working on releasing some music in time. I think my next project really is trying to figure out my next project. How about that? Yeah.
It's a good answer.
Yeah.
Are there any other photographers doing research-based work like yourself that you have your eye on or whom you have found influential?
Oh yeah, for sure. With Vintage Black Canada, like I wasn't doing anything new that hadn't been done in the United States. Renata Shirley's, who runs this thing called Black Archives, which is essentially like Vintage Black Canada times 1,000. Renata's we're colleagues, and there are other folks such as Renata, and it becomes a small world once you start diving in. I follow a bunch of sites from my Vintage Black Canada page of just folks doing archival research with photography research, but it is mostly in the United States, from what I can tell, like sort of like on this level, and that's cool. I mean, it's really inspiring. Let me see though. Wales Bonner, who is a fashion designer from the UK, and so it's a fashion label. Like when they release their collections, they release, and so it's infused with this idea of the Black Atlantic and Jamaican transnationalism and Black Britishness and all these things, sort of post-colonial, like India, like all these cool mishmashes of existence. Wales Bonner, they release a magazine. It's free, and there's a lot of like research that goes into those magazines, and the collections are really, really, really remarkable. It just looks like, the sort of stuff that you see Bob Marley wearing in the early '80s, just before he passed, and but modern day clothing. So Wales Bonner, I would check that out.
Looks like, let me just make sure I've got all the questions here. 1 second. Yeah, I think that's it for, hold on a second. Oh, hold on, here we go. Yeah, so somebody says, Jennifer, I love the name Vintage Black Canada. What was the process for coming up with the name?
Well, I used to be the kind of person that was obsessed with details. I still am, but I've learned to let go a little bit. So with Vintage Black Canada, I had maybe 3 or 4 names, and I remember messaging my brothers, who I run everything by, and not getting a response in time. And I was just like, like F it. This is what it is, so that's how. You just gotta let go.
Yeah. Tara wants to know if you lent out the photos for the Gerald show.
No, haven't let those out yet. No. Taking my time. I'm learning, I'm trying to establish literally the provenance of these photos and build up the reputation. And then so there'll definitely be like some sort of Gerald Dawn focused exhibit. I had a couple of exhibits canceled because of COVID, so Gerald Dawn stuff will come out.
Let's see here. Mike thanks us for this conversation, and he would like to know what Aaron is currently reading, or if he has any recent reads he'd like to recommend.
Oh, recent reads. So just as I read a lot of journal articles now, sadly. I mean, for better for worse, because I'm a student. So recent reads. A History of 7 Killings is a book that I just picked up and haven't got to read it yet. And it's written by a Jamaican author, but based in the UK. and it won the Giller Prize or something like that. And it essentially takes place around the time of when someone made an attempt on Bob Marley's life. I think it was like 78 or 79, something like that. And it's an interesting time. I mean, for folks that might have be aware somewhat of this idea of the CIA's involvement in crack cocaine in Los Angeles and the Iran-Contra affair and how money was funneled and that sort of thing. This really, this stuff happened, but it's not often known that Jamaica was part of that destabilization campaign as well. So there's a great deal of like fascinating reads that one can have about the CIA's activities in Jamaica and destabilized Jamaica, which was leaning hard socialist and had a lot of like shared a lot of similar views with the Cubans during that time. So the history of 7 killings takes place during that time, and it tells different perspectives of 7 different killings, but they're all sort of intertwined with that murky sort of Monroe Doctrine intrigue of the Caribbean. Caribbean's crazy, fascinating place. So hey, that's a good book, and I do see
it is a fantastic read. I'm just going
to. Have
to
you read it?
Oh yeah, I read it a couple years ago. It's just like it's one of the best speculative histories I've ever read. And my interest in Marley, yeah, but Marley is a sub character in it. It's really all the characters around that sort of form the narrative. It's pretty phenomenal. Yeah, awesome. I just had to.
Sweet.
Let's see. Conan would like to know if you still have the Rolleiflex camera that your grandfather shot with. If so, have you considered taking pictures with it yourself? And do you have an opinion on analog or digital photography? So a couple of things in there.
Great question. Yeah. So the Rolleiflex, yes, I grabbed, I'm the oldest brother, so I kind of think ahead. So I have all my grandfather's cameras. I gave the Rolleiflex to my middle brother, who is the established professional photographer. So he's been doing his thing with it, and I remember inquiring with him. He was like, you know what? It was kind of expensive developing the film, is what he said. I remember that. So I didn't push him on it. So will I take pictures with myself? I'm not sure. I have my eyes set on the camera. I'm kind of like a very like sort of loyal end user where I kind of know exactly what I want and I'm going to buy it, and then that's it. So I'm not sure. I don't think I'm interested in shooting with the Rolleiflex. It's got a cool look. It essentially like has the natural look for those who aren't aware that like you can get with if you like use that awful Instagram filter that gives you greater depth. That's just like the natural look of the Rolleiflex. This sort of really good depth, but I'm a Leica guy. I just like the way that Leicas look. So for me, that's where I'm going.
And what about, is that digital or is that analog? That was the other part of the question.
Good question. So it's digital. I do have some analog cameras, but I think there's nothing wrong with going digital. I kind of like the hybrids, like with the way that Leicas are made. They kind of got their feet in both worlds in a really cool way, and I'm okay with that. I used to be like a dumb traditionalist, like sorry, no disrespect to anyone, but like, like, oh, I'll never use MP3s, like I used to say that, when I was like 19, like it's just ridiculous. My turntable right now is a type of turntable that I can play it through my mixer with like a diamond tip and like a real record player. But if I wanted to, I can plug it into my computer. So.
Cool. We have a question wondering if there's ever going to be a dance party with your granddad's vinyl.
Absolutely. I used to have residencies at the Jamaican-born, Waterloo, and Arabella Park. So I love playing records for folks. So just a matter of the province opening up.
Yeah, remember going out? Yes. Let's see. I'm wondering how Aaron's experience engaging with China and potentially also the Chinese language has impacted him and also perhaps his art.
Yeah, like I said earlier, it's my everything. It's definitely informed who I was and the direction I would take. The only reason I went back to school was to learn about China, and all my best marks are in like Chinese politics and history and that sort of thing. And I devoted hours to learning Chinese language. It was a fun challenge, and it continues to be. And it's like one of these lifelong things, sort of like studying China is like, it's like fashion. It never finishes. It just there's always something to learn. So it's influenced everything about me.
That's great. Let's see, just double check to make sure I haven't missed anything. Okay, we got those two there.
I do think Charles, I think, wanted to confirm the spelling of Wells Bonner.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, you have it right, Charles.
Got it.
Okay. Yeah, I think those are all the questions. Unless anybody has anything last minute they'd like to add or ask. Okay. All right, so I guess we'll just wrap it up. So thank you, Aaron and Ivan. That was wonderful. Thank you all of our audience members for asking such great questions and for spending your time with us this evening. I'd encourage you to visit our website at www.CAFKA.21.CAFKA.org to see a detailed list of upcoming programs and also to find out what public art is available for you to view right now. And with that, we'll sign off for this evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
And thank you for hosting and inviting us to this, Claudine.
Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.